Relive, remember, and relate at decades.com. See exclusive video content like Sounds of the Times and Across the Decades, featuring interviews and stories on music, pop culture, history, and entertainment. And put your knowledge to the test with fun and exciting quizzes and articles. Plus, stay on top of our schedule with up-to-date info on the Weekend Binge and our programming specials. Relive, remember, and relate at decades.com now.
Well, growing up, I knew my grandfather had been orphaned as a child and that his parents had died very quickly, but I didn't really know the context. And suddenly in 1995, in a conversation about this and that, my dad sort of dropped what for me was kind of a bombshell. Like, wait, what? My great-grandparents died in the flu pandemic? They died very quickly in 4 days, one on February 25th, one on February 29th. I have the photograph of him and his brother and his parents. I had it right next to my desk the entire time. My grandpa lived with the loss of his parents his entire life. And in some ways, I'm kind of mortified that I never gave him a chance to tell me the story of what that was like and what happened to him. But that was a nationwide phenomenon that Americans simply silenced that story. It somehow didn't fit with where the nation was, with what Americans wanted to say about themselves in a public sense. And so it was just essentially forgotten publicly.
The pandemic of 1918-1919 was the greatest devastation of the 20th century, and in all likelihood, in the whole of human history.
If you look at the Cambridge Encyclopedia of World Events, even as late as the 50s, the Spanish flu didn't even warrant an entry.
How can it have avoided collective memory, if there's such a thing as collective memory? Not just in the States, worldwide. There are no well-known prominent memorials. There are no great memory sites. There are no museums dedicated to it.
50 million people estimated died worldwide.
50 million minimum, maybe twice that.
If the equivalent number were to die today, adjusting for population growth, we're talking of the order of 400 million people.
And yet, anything to be associated with memory and commemoration is not there. I've always been puzzled, even before I was an academic, with the story of this flu, which was forgotten.
We're in the midst of the First World War. The Germans have launched their last major offensive in March.
And then we have trickles of information, often in local newspapers, that would report that this person has come down with influenza, or that person has come down with influenza.
It's going largely unnoticed because the nation is very busy prosecuting a war, getting those troops over to the Western Front.
Officials are not really all that concerned, and you'll find in the records many public health officials saying it's just influenza, it's just in the military camps, it'll burn itself out pretty quickly. But by late September into early October in particular, they realize the explosiveness of this disease, and they go from a handful of civilian cases to quickly hundreds and hundreds of cases per day coming in.
The second wave was the part that was the worst. The fall and winter of 1918 was the worst part.
It was gruesome.
There were reports of people dying in half a day, that they would get up in the morning, maybe feeling slightly ill, and by later that afternoon had dropped dead.
They would often enter a phase of delirium, maybe unconsciousness because of the really high fevers.
They would often develop what's called heliotropic cyanosis, where they were basically suffocated. They couldn't get enough oxygen.
Not only were the elderly and the very young affected, as they always are in these infectious diseases, but for reasons that even to this day we can't fully explain, the young, healthy people, if you like, the working adults who had no other medical problems, these people would get influenza and its complications at much, much higher rates than we would have expected. One of the ways of understanding the severity of this illness, of this pandemic, is to think about it in terms of the average life expectancy. Now, we have had our own recent pandemic, not the one we're going through now, but we've had our own terrible opioid pandemic, which caused for the first time a loss in the or a decrease in the average life expectancy, and that decreased life expectancy was about 0.1 of a year, 1/10 of 1 year. To put that into perspective, in 1918, the average life expectancy loss was 12 years. So it was 120 times greater than the life expectancy loss through our own terrible opioid epidemic.
There's actually no reason why we didn't remember, and so we have to look at the practice of how it happened and follow the stories.
I think it's very hard for us to really get our heads around just how different a time it was. People were focused on the war effort.
Woodrow Wilson never spoke of the flu pandemic publicly, not one time. 675,000 Americans will die in this catastrophic event, and he simply won't talk about it. He wants the nation to stay focused on the war. The federal government played essentially no role, except for a negative one. Not only did President Wilson never talk about the pandemic, but he encouraged the ongoing fundraising for the war, the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive. This was a war that was paid for by private donation. And that Fourth Liberty Loan kicks off right in the middle of the pandemic. So in Philadelphia, they will hold a Fourth Liberty Loan parade to which thousands of people will come. And the consequences are that just a few days later, the city will begin to be overwhelmed by its numbers of cases. Really important part of the context is that if Americans were a little more used to federal intervention in their lives because of the war or expectations from the federal government of them, there wasn't the same built-in expectation that the federal government would look after you. But by and large, the handling of the pandemic, that was done at the local level.
Most of the cities that we studied did implement various social distancing measures. They were not as sweeping as we see today.
In many cases, they can see that it's making a difference because, right, the pandemic slows and they get to go back to their normal lives. Unfortunately, often that happens too quickly.
By Armistice Day on November 11th, a lot of cities are coming down off of that peak, and they think they're in the clear.
There was an impulse to sort of roll what happened with the flu into what happened with the war and focus on the fact that the war was won.
And a lot of cities open up right either on or very close to Armistice Day. And so you have both the pent-up frustration of the war and of these non-pharmaceutical interventions being released at the same time. You get masses of people going out. In Denver, there's an 8,000-seat auditorium that is filled to overcapacity to listen to talks on the end of the war. In San Francisco, they're going to the boxing match, including the mayor, the city health commissioner, a bunch of congressmen, a justice at the Supreme Court. And of course, in a great many cities, that peak is not really over. They think they're on the other side of it, and they get another peak of infection in November, until late November, all the way through in December, and then that leads into the third wave in January through the spring of 1919. But very differently from today, there is a certain understanding still in 1918 that people are going to die of infectious diseases.
Devastating infectious disease was something that people knew and recognized.
People lived with things like tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, pertussis. People died of these diseases. It was tragic, but it was sort of part of life.
There was less shock about it. There was more of an acceptance that we are mortal.
On the one hand, the flu is going around. People are already building a memory of it based on previous traumas. And previous traumas are telling them this is not the most serious event. So in a way, they're already pre-forgetting it. Even as you see death and devastation around you, people are telling you, well, it's only flu. We've gone through such epidemics before. There's other events happening. We've got to focus on the war effort. Let's move on. Let's recover. All these pressures are happening already at the time itself.
Also, there's a factor that it doesn't really fit into our storytelling. It doesn't have a nice, neat beginning, middle, and end. And maybe it's just harder to know what actually happened.
Visit decades.com for daily and weekly schedules, program descriptions, video, and more. Log on and look back at decades.com.
At this point, what we call allopathic medicine or Western medicine was really in a triumphant place. There was this growing belief that infectious disease might become a thing of the past. They had the first vaccine for diphtheria. They were finding the causal agent for everything from typhoid to yellow fever. These were massively important medical discoveries. They had this sense that they were really in the ascendance and that the moment was coming when infectious disease would simply be something that physicians and scientists could control.
They felt they'd conquered something, that they understood about bacteria. They had made huge inroads in terms of hygiene and sanitation and preventing outbreaks of bacterial disease, but they were pretty much completely unaware of the existence of viruses. So there was a whole, domain of the microbial universe which they were blind to. And of course, flu is caused by a virus.
Scientists are often led astray by what they know, and what they don't know is what they can't see. The big mistake was the Robert Koch Institute had isolated what they called the bacillus of influenza, and that led people astray for years. So when influenza came along in 1918, everyone in laboratories was trying to culture this bacillus, and it wasn't bacillus, it's actually a virus. That knowledge blinded them to the real cause of the Spanish flu pandemic.
Modern medicine promised that it could deal with it, and it couldn't deal with this disease. It was caught helpless. So part of the story is the embarrassment of doctors.
There are some very moving reports from physicians about the failure of them to do anything in the face of this tragedy.
Victor Vaughn, who was a very important player in the American medical scene, was serving in the military in a high-ranking position. He talks about that in the memory chambers of his brain, certain images hang, and talks about his inability to take care of the young men that he first saw at Camp Devens when he was sent there to look into what was going on with this new influenza that was taking place.
All these soldiers, he describes them as piled up, stacked up like cordwood.
And it was clear that his sort of sense of himself as a professional had been terribly damaged.
And in terms of patient care, there really wasn't a whole lot that doctors could do. We didn't have ventilators. So basically it was finding bed space for them in hospitals that were often overcrowded, propping them up, hopefully so that they didn't choke on their own sputum, and maybe giving them a little bit of broth if they had an appetite and could eat something. That's about what you could do for an influenza patient in 1918.
We had no vaccines. They tried to make crude serums. None of them really effective. So afterwards, a lot of medics didn't really want to dwell on this great failure.
The flip side of it is the way nurses respond. This was a moment of great triumph. It's not that they don't see the tragedy in it, and they write about how sad it is to serve.
From the moment I left the train, I saw that terrible look of horror in the face of everyone whom I met. The stricken horror in the eyes above the masks was something never to be forgotten.
And then they go on to talk about how magnificent it was to have that opportunity, to see the nurses step forward, just as they had in the trenches of Europe, to do what was needed, and that they were, in a sense, as valorous as were those very troops in Europe. For these female nurses, it's a moment of success in the public sphere.
The happy memories of the epidemic are many, the list of treasured experiences is long.
I think that a lot of women who became nurses had a sense that they were on a mission. So to see it confirmed to them how important it was that they were able to apply their knowledge to this situation, I think was heartening for them.
I was glad of the opportunity. I saw at a glance I had work to do. I worked day and night trying to save them for 7 days.
Nurses is a heroic story. And here there's a gender dynamic at play. There's a famous image which in many ways tells it all. A male doctor is instructing a female nurse how to take care of a patient. The female nurse who has real aid to help nurse this person back to health is being instructed by a doctor who really has no idea what to do. But he's the voice of authority and she's looking up at him with authority. Doctors overcame and overshadowed the memory and eclipsed the memory of the heroism of the nurses, which is very sad. That's a story which was seldom told.
I also think that there was, at the time, sort of a sense that a woman is the one who would always be self-sacrificing, would always do what needed to be done to make sure that everyone was happy. And so I think in some way there may have been sort of a expectation, yes, nurse is nurse. That's what it is.
In general, there's a gender aspect to what is remembered and what is forgotten.
In history in general, there's always a kind of bias towards who wrote the story, who commands the narrative. It's the most powerful people in the game at the time.
Newspapers were gatekeepers. They control what information was deemed important.
The people really do rely on the newspaper, so everybody has a newspaper, right? Even the smallest communities will have a newspaper, and in those local newspapers, you really do get a lot of coverage.
Those were the local newspapers. The national newspapers also reported on this sort of more globally, but was done in a way that was striking in how it tended to minimize the news.
This is wartime. I think there was probably a lot of self-censorship at the editorial level in newspapers to not necessarily bury the stories, but to make sure that the headlines led with issues about the war effort and not so much about the death and destruction being wrought by the influenza epidemic.
The reason why it's called the Spanish flu, because Spain was neutral and didn't censor its press, so reported the first cases there, whereas in the warring nations they kept that information out of the newspapers because they were worried about morale of the population taking a knock.
There was enough bad news going on to report. Now, that's not to say that influenza was never reported on the front pages, because it certainly was, but I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of historical newspapers from that period, and it is striking how many of them relegate the reports of influenza to the middle and to the back pages. I think it's the back page of the Washington Post from that period where there is this headline that the influenza will claim more deaths than the war. Now, you and I would have thought that that would be an incredible headline, right? But it was on the very back page of the Washington Post. So it really sort of underscored this attempt to minimize just what a great blow this was to people.
And there was also kind of a much more paternalistic attitude where people in power were afraid of the mob, giving too much information to people in case they panicked and became unruly. All of these factors went towards limiting the understanding that people had of what was actually happening in terms of the disease. The thing that really struck me right from the beginning of researching this was that pretty much everybody I spoke to had some family memory of somebody who either died in the pandemic or had, been infected and recovered, or some story that was related to it. It's this strange thing where it's an individual memory. We don't remember it as something that happened to humanity as a whole.
Which is part of the story of the 20th century always. The story is always a story of recovery. And people moved on, preferred to speak about the great memories of World War I, whether it was defeat or whether it was victory. These were the key issues which could be politicized. I think one of the keys here is, can we politicize? Can it enter into memory because we can fit it into a story which we need, and we can use that memory to serve a purpose? And there are cases like that with epidemics. There's a classic case. AIDS as an epidemic was almost instantly remembered.
Everyone knows about HIV/AIDS because it had a tremendous social and cultural impact at the time. The Spanish flu was different. It really didn't have big impact. It didn't even have major economic impact. Novelists didn't really write about it. There weren't many songs to it, and very few artists bothered to document it. One of the exceptions was Edvard Munch, who painted 2 striking portraits, one of himself before Spanish influenza, and the second after he'd recovered.
So many people lived through what was a terribly traumatic experience, and then they never had a chance to kind of process it with others. Recovery from trauma involves, at least in part, the opportunity to tell the story of one's trauma and to be heard, right? To share one's experience and to have others acknowledge it is really important. And so I think again and again of all those millions of people who weren't given that opportunity.
And that's a problem with a pandemic, because we've got millions of people. I mean, who are the people who are worst affected in a pandemic? It's the poorest, the most remote, the people with least access to authority, to healthcare, to anything really, with the least voice. And there is clearly a big problem there in the storytelling of this catastrophe. I mean, surely humanity should know about these things that happen to them. If we don't remember that this happens to us, if we don't realize that, for example, there have been 15 flu pandemics in the last 500 years and there will be more, then we're not going to prepare as well as we should, are we? And so the result is that we're always amazed when it happens, when we shouldn't be. We should be calmly, rationally doing the things that we have learnt work, and then realizing that there are things to do once the pandemic is over that will make us more prepared for the next one, and will mean that there is less suffering when it happens.
Relive, remember, and relate at decades.com. See exclusive video content like Sounds of the Times and Across the Decades, featuring interviews and stories on music, pop culture, history, and entertainment. And put your knowledge to the test with fun and exciting quizzes and articles. Plus, stay on top of our schedule with up-to-date info on the Weekend Binge and our programming specials. Relive, remember, and relate at decades.com now.